That is so important to keep the IEP meeting student-centered. So I always tell parents, even if your student is not at the IEP meeting, we should have him or her present in some way.
Welcome to Talking About Kids. I am your host, R. Bradley Snyder, researcher, activist, and author of The 5 Simple Truths of Raising Kids. Do you have questions about the IEP process or even what an IEP is? Well, you are not alone. Thankfully, my guest this episode can help. Vicki Christensen is an experienced, certified IEP advocate. As she describes in her forthcoming book, Uniquely, Fully Enough, The Neurodivergent Parenting Journey, a Memoir and Handbook, Vicki has seen it all as a parent and as a professional. She and I discuss some of what she has learned and how you can apply the lessons to the kids in your life. Talking About Kids is sponsored in part by the Arizona Department of Health Services Must Stop Bullying campaign through its Title V Maternal and Child Health Program. For more information, go to muststopbullying.org. If the information in this episode gives you a better understanding of the IEP process, well, there's a good chance it will help somebody else you know. So please like it and then share it. And now, the interview.
I'm a mom to my oldest son, Luke, who is 21, and Luke was born with a rare chromosome disorder. So rare that we have found one other person in the world that has the same disorder as Luke. He lives in New Zealand, by the way. But I also have a son, Everett, who is 17, and Everett is very different than his brother, but also neurodivergent. He has ADHD, the inattentive type, and also struggles with auditory processing. So I've been a special education advocate for the past 15 years. And I started doing that because when Luke was 6 years old, I was sitting in an IEP meeting and I thought to myself, wow, my baseline on IEPs is pretty close to zero. So I need to educate myself. And I took a course, a certificate course at the University of San Diego. It was taught primarily by an attorney, a special education attorney, and it was a certificate in special education advocacy. So I learned a lot about the history of IDEA. I learned about my rights as a parent, Luke's rights, and from there, I took an internship with someone I met in that class. And 15 years later, I've been advocating. The past 5 years, I've had my own small business called Glasses Advocacy. So while it's just me, I collaborate with a lot of other advocates in the area as well as special education attorneys.
I'm going to take a step back because you mentioned this in your book, Uniquely, Fully Enough, The Neurodivergent Parenting Journey, a Memoir and Handbook. But you already said 3 letters, IEP. Now, in your
Mhm.
book, you talk about stepping into your very first IEP meeting and feeling like you were listening to, I believe, NASA codes, is what you said. So, for those people who aren't familiar with the IEP, or they've heard it, or they've even been in the meeting, what is an IEP?
I'll very quickly tell you what an IEP is not. We'll
Okay.
start there. It is not a 50-page document that
Mhm.
ends with a signature.
Hmm.
And that's how a lot of parents describe it. But an IEP it's an individualized learning plan. And the key word there is individualized. It looks different for every student. There should be no copying and pasting in an IEP. So An IEP first addresses and identifies strengths that a student has and areas of need. And once those areas of need are identified, IEP goals are written to address those areas. Then it goes on to provide services. So how is a student going to work on those IEP goals and make progress on those goals? Through service delivery. Perhaps a teacher, a special education teacher, pushes into a classroom, or a student gets pull out, or a student needs a separate classroom
Mhm.
altogether. That is defined in that service delivery, and then it contains supports, all the supports that that student needs, that student with a disability needs to be successful at school. And I'll go on because there's 2 parts of the IEP. The first is what I just explained,
Mhm.
and it's writing the document, right? The second is the implementation
Yeah.
of the IEP, and that's the tricky part.
Yeah.
So, I
Well,
have seen.
and if it's okay with you, Vicky, because again, it is, you know, you're super passionate about this, and that's why you founded the Blue Glasses Advocacy, is to help people with this process. But I want to slow down just a minute because even in your simplification of it, there's a couple things here that I want to make sure my listeners are aware of. In your own story, there were problems at each of those steps that you mentioned. In the first part, just creating the IEP, in your own story, I think you might agree that the bigger issues were actually in the implementing it, which in my experiences with IEPs too tends to be where it falls apart. But even in the creating of it, you mentioned the first step is identifying the student's needs. Vicky, who gets to say what the student's needs are?
The IEP team. And
Good.
let me clarify who is part of that
Right.
IEP
Thank you.
team. It starts with the parents
Right.
or the guardians. They are absolutely, in my opinion, the most important person on that IEP team. But it includes the teachers,
Mhm.
right? General education teachers, special education teachers, um, related service providers, speech therapists, occupational therapists, physical therapists, counselors. It could be mental health support. So, all the people that are providing services to the student.
And am I correct in saying that even when there's assessments involved, you don't necessarily have to only use the school's assessors, the district's people that they bring in for assessments, right? You can bring in your own assessments.
Absolutely. And I want one point that is very important for parents to know and understand. At the beginning of every IEP meeting, procedural safeguards are offered.
Mm.
And it's usually with a little chuckle, ha ha ha, well, they haven't changed. You've probably gotten so many, you can wallpaper, your bedroom with these. Read them, understand them. They are very important. And as part of the procedural safeguards, it explains independent educational evaluations.
Yeah.
So, yes, so if your student is assessed by the district and you have an IEP meeting to review those assessments and you disagree with them, you do have the right to request independent evaluations. Correct.
I want to bring this up because it is for anybody who's attended an IEP meeting. One of the things that I find particularly irksome about an IEP meeting is that it's often the case that school staff have been meeting before you arrive. So when you arrive, either you're the advocate with parents or you're a parent alone or a parent in a couple, parents with an advocate. At most, you're about 3 people, and you walk into this big room and there's 8 people already there and they already know each other and they're seating you at one end of a table and they're all crowded around the other end of it. And it can be incredibly intimidating, can't it?
Absolutely. And that happens almost all the time.
Yeah.
Parents, when I am a parent or when I walk in as an advocate with parents, the team is already almost always seated at the table.
Yeah.
Like they're ready to go. They've already had their pre-meeting to talk about this. So it can be intimidating, but there's a couple things that I recommend that parents do to really keep it more student-centered and collaborative,
Okay.
not us versus you, but student-centered.
And I want to get at those in just a moment, but I want to point out too that you said maybe you disagree with the school about the assessment. Again, in my experience with the IEP process, the people representing the school or who are there in an official capacity, the teachers, counselors, maybe somebody from the district, a district psychologist, maybe the principal or assistant principal, they might not agree with each other, which can be
Mhm.
odd too. Am I right?
Yes, that does happen occasionally, but unfortunately, what I see happens way more than that is that if teachers disagree, they don't feel that they're in a safe space
Mm,
to say so.
it's a very good point. And
Mhm.
it's also the case, and I don't mean to sound down on my educators whom I love, and I hope that
Mm.
longtime listeners of the Talking About Kids podcast know that I've been on their side, for decades now. But it's also my experience that sometimes when teachers disagree, it kind of correlates with the teachers that get the most out of a student versus the ones that are getting the least out of the student. They'll have radically different ideas about the student's
Mhm.
needs, which can be kind of hard to parse, especially because, what I think parents want to say is, well, yeah, you're just a good teacher. And that's why it's working for you, but which is unfair, and it doesn't translate well into the language of an IEP. Um, so once you agree on a student's needs, then you start to put in what into the IEP to help them get those needs met?
So you write present levels.
Okay.
And that, you go through academic areas, math, reading, writing. Because it's always important to start with the student's strengths,
Yes.
right? So you talk about the strengths the student has, but then you also identify based on the assessments and also based on work samples and how a student is achieving, in the classroom, you you identify very clearly their areas of need. So you're going to go through academics, communication, motor skills, behavior, adaptive, vocational. And once those areas of need are specific and clearly identified, you want to write very specific, measurable IEP goals that address each of those areas of need.
Right. And, it's with those goals too, these aren't ideally, this isn't something that you are returning to once a year, right? You're looking at progress to those goals over the course of the school year, ideally. And I know that doesn't always
Correct.
happen either, right? That's one of those things that can be easily brushed over sometimes.
Absolutely. And a great tip for parents is anytime you're in an IEP meeting, ask and calendar when progress is due, right?
Right.
When are those progress reporting periods? Because they differ district to district. So it's very important. And the IEP, yes, it's a fluid document. You do not have to wait until the next year, nor should you. So I encourage parents to first calendar when
Hmm.
progress is due, but when progress is due, ask for the work samples and the data that was used to measure progress.
Right.
Very important.
And that's such a great tip about knowing when that progress is due, because it could be that if you're not looking for it, you're going to get this kind of frantic message from the school. Oh, we need these documents signed right away because we need to turn in our update on it, and you might feel rushed to actually pay close attention and really think about how well the IEP is working for your kid.
Absolutely. You wanna be involved, and I always say that transparency, that communication throughout the school year, and that looks different for
Right.
every family, right? I have families that communicate on a weekly basis with the teacher to get mini updates. And then I have families who, at the very least, wait until the progress reporting period and ask for the work samples so they understand that progress, how it's being measured, what their student is actually producing in the classroom, and is true progress being made.
The other thing that happens in these IEP meetings is when they start to talk about all of the accommodations that might be available to a student. Some can sound foreign. My kids never had this before. Some can sound, rather extreme, I guess, to some parents. I believe when I've talked to parents about this, that well, how's that going to look? How's that going to work? Is my kid going to get pulled out of the class? Is like, are they going to be separated? How are they going to feel about it? Are they going to be embarrassed? Sometimes what they're actually saying is, am I going to be embarrassed if my kid is receiving these accommodations? So, what's your advice about these kind of accommodations that get discussed?
So, if we're truly talking about accommodations, I always start by telling parents there are a lot of students that get accommodations.
Yes.
So, for
Yes.
example, if your student needs to take assessments in a separate, like smaller, quiet room, guess what? There's usually a handful of other students who have to as well.
Right.
This is something that other students are used to seeing in the classroom. So there are often quite a few students who are also receiving accommodations, and that helps parents, and both parents and the student maybe feel a little more comfortable, because if your students never receive that, it does sound kind of foreign. What do you mean they're going to be pulled out? And I also like to explain that accommodations are needed support so that your child can access the curriculum, right?
Right.
It evens the playing field. This is not something that they have to outgrow, or they may not outgrow. It's an accommodation that they can get in school and very often into college. It again, it evens the playing field for students.
Yeah, and unfortunately, sometimes, you don't even know if it works until it's in the IEP and they have a chance to try it, right? And it's a case where, if you're in, there are elementary schools even, let alone junior high and high school, where students go to different classrooms for different subjects, and in some subjects with some teachers, the accommodation is might be required, and others it might not. So to your point, it's kind of a good idea to have it there and
Yes.
see what's going to be. Now, the other one that's kind of tricky is if the recommendation is that the student is pulled from their typical class and either put
Mhm.
into a special education program for the whole day or for one or more subjects or once a week. This is where that implementation also gets really bizarre. But this all gets written into the IEP. They're going to be pulled out for once a week, and I've always struggled with some of these. Tell me a little bit about what parents can expect in terms of students being put in special programs.
Sure. So let's talk about a student who's primarily a general education student, but maybe needs some pull-out time for reading skills or for math skills. So in elementary school, for example, it's usually pull-out services
Mhm.
to a learning center or a resource room. And I think a couple things very important to consider if your child is receiving pull-out, because parents very often worry, well, what are they
What are
missing?
they
Right?
missing? Right.
They're in the gen ed and they're supposed to be learning with their peers, and now you're taking them out of that classroom. And it's very important to discuss with the IEP team when that pullout is going to happen. And what I recommend is, for example, if it's pullout for math, the student should be in the general education math class for instruction, right? They are receiving the same instruction as all the other students in the classroom. But maybe when it comes to that independent work time, that's when they can be pulled out and work one to one or in a small group in a resource room. So they are not, I always tell parents they will not be missing instruction as long as that's discussed with the
Right.
IEP team and scheduling.
So let's now get into this idea of the implementation. And there's two pieces of it that I want to talk about. And I'll follow your lead on it because, again, most of my listeners by this point they probably haven't read Uniquely Fully Enough, your book. Uh, but you've had just about every implementation experience that I think a family can go through. And I know that you bring that into your advocacy. I think I want to talk about this thing that bridges the IEP to implementation, which is this idea of inclusion. Can you
Mhm.
explain what inclusion is supposed to be and sometimes what it looks like in practice?
Yeah, absolutely, and inclusion is my sweet spot. I'm very passionate about it, and inclusion, it goes so far beyond being in a general education classroom,
Mhm.
right? So, when my son, and if it's okay, I'll use my son as an example.
Please,
When
yeah.
he was in elementary school, he spent about, and I should say Luke's, he has, both physical and intellectual disabilities.
Mhm,
And so he's pretty far behind grade level and always was. But I still felt that there were so many benefits
mhm,
for him to be included with his general education peers. So inclusion, you know, first day of school, I always wanted Luke to be on that class roster. Like if he's going to be spending some time in a general education classroom, he should be on the roster. He should have a desk,
mhm,
right? It should have a name tag with his name on it. He should be doing work that is aligned with the rest of the students. Now, it may be modified. He may have heavy accommodations, but it should be similar to what the other students are doing.
yeah,
He should be included field trips. I mean, you would think that would be a given, but it's unfortunately not always the case. He should be spending all those unstructured times of day with his general education peers.
mhm,
So, other parents of students in the classroom should know him. He should have peer buddies in the classroom. Essentially, he's just another student. Maybe he's not there all the time. Maybe he answers differently with an
mhm,
AAC device or an augmented communication device,
mhm.
but he is another student in that classroom.
And I wanna point out that the research is pretty conclusive on this. Not only is inclusionary education good for the student, in this case, we're talking about a student with an IEP, it's good for the whole class, or it can be when it's done well. Now, it can be done really poorly. You have examples of this in your book,
Mm.
or suggestions that were made of how to do it in your book. I think you fought against it happening the way that they originally pitched it to you. Um, I'm thinking of one example, but
Yeah.
the case is that it does benefit everyone because the other thing that is really important to know, and my teachers know this, but it's worth stating again, and for parents to hear. Every class, every lesson, there are going to be students who are at different levels of understanding the subject matter being taught. The rest of the class is not a monolith, and then you have one kid that's on an IEP. Number one, there's a lot of kids on IEP, and everybody is consuming the subject matter at their own rate. So at any given moment, we're teaching to the greatest common denominator, but that means that there's always kids that are a little ahead and a little bit behind at every moment of every day. So,
Mhm.
and in a really good classroom, those students work together to get everybody over that finish line. And I've seen it done, and I know that in the research, and I just want to mention, I know I'm on a bit of a soapbox here, Vicky, but I do know that there are parents, and sometimes they're parents of the students who aren't on an IEP are worried about their kid being held back. And I need to say that's not the case. When it's done well, everybody succeeds, and they're actually better off because of it.
Mhm.
All right, I'm done. I'm getting off my soapbox now. But in addition to how the inclusion is done, and i- when it's done poorly, and I won't make you say it, I'll say it. When it's done poorly, this is the idea where this kind of tokenism. We include the student once a week. I am going to use the example from your book. Once a week, we parade the kids from the
Mhm.
special ed classroom through the classroom of non-special ed students. They get a little parade.
Mhm.
I've been witness to it where Once a week, the student council visits the special education classroom, and that's their
Right.
inclusion that they do. And so, that's when it's done poorly. When it's done well, the students just know that everybody has special gifts and special needs, and we're all working through them to all of our success. And again, longtime listeners will notice that's also one of the hallmarks of a safe school, one that is bullying free, where the gifts and contributions of all students are equally recognized and rewarded. Where else can the implementation of an IEP go awry, Vicky?
So, can I speak just a minute to like what you just said?
Yes,
Because
I
I,
said a
I have
lot.
so
What
much to
part of that? I
add
said too
about that
much. Yes, go.
inclusion piece.
Whatever you want to
No,
say.
but I just, when inclusion is done right
Yeah,
and it works,
yeah.
it's a team effort, right? I mean, I work with so many amazing educators. And where it works, you have the general education teacher who's open to the idea. If work needs to be modified, you have a special education teacher helping with some of those modifications. Because let's be honest, it's at some point a gen ed teacher has 30 some students. So it needs to be a team effort. And also, students, right? Especially if you start in elementary school, they're so open and they want to learn. And very often they don't know what to say if someone appears to be different
Right.
or neurodivergent. So, what we really have to work toward is educating the students too. Give them some
Hmm.
language. It's okay to ask, why do you talk with that machine? Or, why do you do this differently? As a parent, I always say, you can ask any question, but ask the question, right?
Right.
Very often they just don't say anything. So I think when a school, it starts with administration and then the educators help those gen ed students learn like what to say and how to interact when it's different. That is when it just becomes this beautiful thing where we're the same, we're different, but we're all students in this classroom. And I came from a very just collaborative elementary school,
Hmm.
and we did compassion days, right? So we teach students they have to look in a mirror and then write, so they might understand a little bit more about what it means to be dyslexic, or they might have to do fine motor tasks wearing oven mitts, and now they understand, wow, it's difficult to pick up,
Right.
small pieces or to write. And it teaches compassion, and it's educating them, right? It's knowledge. And that's where I see, and especially if you start early in elementary school, by the time they get to middle school, right, with social hierarchies and there all this additional pressure, they're accepting,
Yep.
right? They've already learned how to be friends with someone who may look different.
you know we've had advocates for the deaf on talking about kids, and I'll use that as an example. This is a difference that people pick up on pretty quickly if if you're hard of hearing or deaf. But when you are in an environment that respects all those differences, the little differences that also can be crippling to all students are also respected. So
Mhm.
in a way, to your point, and I just want to reiterate it. We know that schools that recognize these differences and also celebrate all of the contributions of those students, because your kids making a contribution, all the kids with IEPs, there's something special that they're contributing to that environment. And a good school figures out what that is and celebrates that as well. And what we know is that's a bullying free school. That's a school where everybody performs better academically. Their testing scores are higher, their grades are higher. They go on to better things afterwards. So it benefits everyone to put in the time to make this a reality.
Absolutely. And it truly is,
Yeah.
when done right, a win-win
Yeah.
for everyone, for the student who's included, for the the peers around that student, for the teachers, for the school in general, for other parents, right?
Yeah.
Who witness this when they're at school during assemblies. It truly is a win-win.
We were fortunate enough to have like Dorothy Espelage, who is probably um, maybe the single most important bullying researcher today. And she will point out that schools that are kind of monolithic, homogenous schools where they only recognize and celebrate one set of skills, one set of behaviors, those are some of the most dangerous places. Dangerous in terms of mental health, dangerous in terms of anxiety, but physically dangerous to the students involved there because either you
Yeah.
conform or you're a victim. And it's terrible. So this is really great. Let's move on to other things, though. So you've got an IEP in place, and your story is one of learning. Okay, the IEP wasn't the finish line. I need to keep monitoring it. Tell us about that implementation part now, Vicky.
So, as an advocate, when I work with a family, we always first address the implementation, right, at the
Yeah.
IEP meeting. So, let's talk about communication. What is this going to look like? Is it going to be weekly, monthly? Again, calendaring, progress, reporting dates. And then very often parents say to me, well, I'm not there.
Right.
How do I know that my student's receiving his or her services? They don't tell me anything about their school day. Or how do I know they're actually working on these IEP goals and not just getting help during homework on their homework? So, a few other things that I suggest is you can set up observations of your student. Parents can do regular observations. Again, it varies district to district, but you always have the right to observe your student at school. As an advocate, I do quite a few classroom observations. So, it's a snapshot,
Hmm.
definitely, but it's just one more thing. You can see a lot in 30 minutes at school with transitions, unstructured times, classroom times. But the best way, in my opinion, to measure that implementation is that progress on
Hmm.
IEP goals. You need to see work samples. You need to see data. You need to understand those IEP goals. They should be specific, measurable. So if it says that this student will, I'm just going to use an example, read at a fifth grade level, answer WH questions with 80% accuracy. Show me how you got that 80%. Because very often I see progress written like student was at 70%. And then, right, the next progress, students at 75%. Like, let's talk about the work samples. Let's
Yeah.
talk about what's actually happening in the classroom and let them know at at the annual IEP meeting that that's the expectation, right? Again, open communication. I'm going to expect to see those 3 out of 4 work samples to see how progress was measured.
So you've mentioned this before, and part of what your role is now and what you do with Blue Glasses Advocacy is that you are an IEP advocate. Tell me a little bit more about what an IEP advocate does, because, like you said in your book, and I wrote it down because it's a lovely line. You wrote, "It's not a weakness to need help." And so having a child with any sort of special needs can create stress and anxiety in the family. So how might an IEP advocate be of service?
So I'll start by saying I work with some amazing clients, amazing families, and they are educated, right? They are successful with whatever they do in life.
Right.
Very supported, very supportive, loving parents. But they look at this 50-page, right, legal document and they're like, I don't know what LRE, right? SLP, it's a foreign language.
Yeah.
And guess what? I don't have the bandwidth to really decipher and understand. So a lot of parents just need someone who's been through it, someone who's a professional, understands IEPs inside and out to kind of be team up with them at
Hmm.
the IEP meeting. I always recommend let's work together. as a team, right? If you want me to kind of lead off with some of your concerns, I'm happy to do it. Sometimes parents want to start and I kind of chime in, but an advocate can just, you feel like you just have someone else who really understands your perspective in that IEP meeting. And like I said, I've worked with some amazing educators and very strong IEP team members. And this, I think, would be a good tip for some of those individuals who have been doing this for a long time, because sometimes I'm in IEP meetings and the team assumes that parents know something or understand
Hmm.
something. For example, I was in a meeting recently, and there's the general or no, it was the special education teacher, and she said, "Well, I don't understand." Let me start by saying I was representing a family. Student was in 3rd grade, so they had been supporting their student for a couple years, and they had been consenting to the IEP year after year. They brought me in because they had quite a few concerns, and the team said, "Well, we don't understand. You've been consenting to this IEP every year,
Mm.
so how could there be any issues?" And what I explained to the team is that while you do this every day, this process is very foreign to parents, and most parents don't understand that they don't have to consent to the
Yeah.
IEP. They can consent, they can partially consent, right? You can consent with anything, with the exception of anything you don't agree with. Or you can consent to implementation only, meaning I don't agree that this is actually like a free and appropriate public education or FAPE, but you can implement it. Let's not slow things down. But there's so many different ways parents can consent or sign the IEP. And I think sometimes the team, they just don't realize that they need to
Yeah.
educate parents a little bit about their rights.
Well, and and again, longtime listeners know that I talk about this a lot on the channel. But for many parents, school wasn't great for them. And so going into a school can feel unsafe because they feel like they're back in middle school, and that wasn't a good feeling. And these
Mhm.
people that are at the table, even though they're the same age potentially as the parent, they still seem like they're an authority. They still, you remember what it's like to be called to the principal's office, and now the
Mhm.
principal's there, but the principal is, the principal's just Janet. She's not principal. She's just a human, and she's your
Right.
peer, and you should be able to talk about it. But that's not how it always feels, and that's why I do like an IEP advocate, because it kind of, it's just having somebody in your corner who speaks that language, to your point, but they're there for you. Now, you should all be there for the child. It should be a
Yes.
child-centered approach, but it's not always kinda how it works out.
It's not, but that is so important to keep the IEP meeting student-centered.
Yeah,
So I always tell parents, even if your student is not at the IEP meeting, we should have him or her present in some
yeah,
way. I have parents who have brought framed pictures of their student, right? And they put it up on the
yeah,
IE in the table so
yeah,
everybody can see that person. It's a visual. We use student centered language. We use their name when we're talking about them. We don't use language such as they can't or they won't,
yeah.
right? When we're talking about areas of need, are more specific. And right, like this student struggles to attend to a task for more than 5 minutes. We don't say, he won't pay attention. So I think the language we use is very important. And it really should never be us against you. It should be student-centered at all times.
Well, Vicky, I just wanna thank you so much for first of all, for putting your story out there in your book, Uniquely Fully Enough. Thank you for, founding, Blue Glasses Advocacy. If my listeners are someplace where they can't access you in Blue Glasses Advocacy, do you have any tips for how to locate an IEP advocate?
I would start by, honestly, a Google search.
Okay.
Just put special education advocacy, put your area, and there's a good chance that you will get some names of an advocate. Another resource, or another point is that I attend meetings virtually very often.
Okay.
So an advocate doesn't necessarily have to be right within driving
Okay.
distance or attend the meeting. If you really are looking for someone, if you're in a rural area where there truly is not an advocate nearby, just remember you can always find someone to attend the meeting virtually.
Okay. Well, again, thank you so much. And thank you for being a guest on Talking About Kids.
Well, thank you, Brad, very much. I appreciate the opportunity.
That was Vicki Christensen. More information about Vicki, her advocacy firm, and her forthcoming book, Uniquely Fully Enough, The Neurodivergent Parenting Journey, a Memoir and Handbook, is at talkingaboutkids.com. And when you do visit the Talking About Kids website, leave me a note. I would love to hear from you. The Talking About Kids theme song is by the Senators. For more of their music, go to thesenatorsmusic.com. And remember, kids are young goats and young humans, and the difference is that young goats are easier to manage.